The morning frost cracked beneath her trembling boots as 17-year-old Elena Winters stepped onto the battlefield that would either make her a legend or claim her life. Behind her, seasoned warriors whispered doubts about the girl who had never fired a shot in anger. Ahead of her, an army of shadow creatures pressed forward like a living nightmare, their eyes burning with otherworldly hunger. What none of them knew was that Elena carried within her a power so ancient and terrifying that even she didn't understand it. A power that would emerge not through years of training or divine blessing, but through a single moment of desperate courage when everything seemed lost. This is the story of how a novice archer with shaking hands and a heart full of fear discovered that sometimes the greatest weapons are forged not in fire, but in ice. Sometimes legends are born not from those who seek glory, but from those who simply refuse to let others fall. The war was about to witness something that would be spoken of in whispers for generations to come. The day a frozen phantom shot split the very air itself and changed the course of history forever. Elena Winters had never wanted to be a warrior. At 17, she preferred the quiet corners of her father's blacksmith shop, where the only battles were fought between hammer and steel. The rhythmic clang of metal against metal provided a comforting soundtrack to her simple life in the mountain village of Ironhold. Her days were filled with helping her father craft horseshoes and farming tools, not weapons of war. The village nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks, where winters lasted 8 months and summers were brief whispers of warmth. Elena had grown up listening to her grandmother's stories about the old wars, about heroes who could bend the elements to their will and creatures that emerged from the shadows to devour light itself. She had always thought they were just tales meant to keep children from wandering too far into the woods after dark. Everything changed on the morning when Captain Marcus Thorne arrived with his contingent of the Royal Guard. Elena was organizing her father's inventory when she heard the thundering of hooves on cobblestone. Through the shop window, she watched as 24 mounted soldiers in gleaming armor rode into the village square, their banners snapping in the cold mountain wind. Her father, Willem, emerged from the forge with soot-stained hands and concern etched across his weathered face. The arrival of the Royal Guard meant only one thing. War had come to their doorstep. Elena followed him outside, where a crowd was already gathering around the mounted captain. Captain Thorne was a man who commanded respect without demanding it. His silver hair was pulled back in a warrior's knot, and a scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a testament to battles fought and survived. When he dismounted, his movements carried the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades training for combat. His eyes swept over the assembled villagers with the practiced assessment of a military leader. People of Ironhold, his voice carried clearly across the square. I come bearing grave news from the capital. The Shadow Legion has broken through our eastern defenses. They advance toward the mountain passes, consuming everything in their path. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Elena felt her stomach drop as she recognized the name from her grandmother's stories. The Shadow Legion wasn't just an army. It was a force of darkness that had nearly destroyed the kingdom 50 years ago. They were creatures born from nightmare itself, led by the Void King, whose very presence could drain the life from the land. Every able-bodied person must contribute to the defense of our realm, Captain Thorne continued. We seek volunteers to join the Mountain Defense Force. The Royal Guard will provide training and equipment, but we need numbers if we hope to hold the passes. Elena watched as several of the village's young men stepped forward, their faces a mixture of determination and fear. Her childhood friend Marcus, the baker's son, was among them. So was old Henrik's grandson, barely 16 but tall for his age. She felt a strange disconnection, as if she were watching events unfold from a great distance. Her father placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. This is not for you, Elena, he said quietly. You have other gifts. The village will need its craftspeople when this is over. But Elena found herself thinking about her grandmother's final words before she had passed 3 winters ago. She had gripped Elena's hand with surprising strength and whispered, when the shadows return, the ice remembers. The old blood runs cold, but true, child. Do not forget what you are. At the time, Elena had dismissed it as the rambling of an old woman whose mind had begun to wander. Now, watching Captain Thorne's grim expression as he surveyed the volunteers, those words echoed in her mind with uncomfortable resonance. That evening, Elena climbed to her favorite spot on the hillside behind their home. The ancient oak tree there had been her sanctuary since childhood, its gnarled branches perfect for climbing and its canopy offering a clear view of the valley below. She could see the soldiers' campfires dotting the village outskirts like fallen stars. She pulled her cloak tighter against the evening chill and tried to make sense of the strange sensations that had been building in her chest since Captain Thorne's announcement. It felt like something cold and vast stirring to life, as if winter itself had taken residence in her bones. When she exhaled, her breath seemed to hang in the air longer than it should, forming intricate patterns of frost before dissipating. Unusual weather for early autumn, a voice said behind her. Elena spun around to find Captain Thorne approaching. Having climbed the hill with the silent grace she was beginning to associate with experienced warriors. Up close, she could see that his eyes were not the brown she had expected, but a pale blue that seemed to hold depths of knowledge and sadness. "I didn't hear you coming," she admitted. "Old habit," he replied, settling against the tree trunk beside her. "Your father told me I might find you here. He's worried about you. He doesn't want me to volunteer," Elena said. "He thinks I'm too young, too inexperienced." Captain Thorne studied her for a long moment. "Are you considering it?" Elena hesitated. The honest answer was that something deep inside her was pulling toward the conflict, despite her lack of training or desire for violence. "I don't know. I've never held a weapon before. I've never even been in a real fight. But something feels wrong about staying behind while others go to face this darkness." "Training can teach you to hold a weapon," Captain Thorne said carefully. "Experience teaches you when to use it. But there are some things that cannot be taught, only awakened." There was something in his tone that made Elena look at him more closely. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering directly, Captain Thorne reached into his pack and withdrew something wrapped in dark cloth. When he unfolded it, Elena's breath caught. Inside lay a bough unlike anything she had ever seen. The wood was pale as winter moonlight, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the dim light. The string appeared to be woven from silver and ice, though when she looked closer, she realized it was something far more complex than either. "This belonged to your grandmother," Captain Thorne said quietly. "She asked me to give it to you when the time was right." Elena stared at the weapon, her mind reeling. "My grandmother?" But she was just a village storyteller. She never mentioned owning a bow, let alone one like this. Captain Thorne's expression grew distant. Lydia Winters was many things, but just a storyteller was not one of them. 50 years ago, when the Shadow Legion first rose, she was among those who stood against them. She was the last of the Frost Archers, wielders of an ancient magic that could bind winter itself to their will. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Her grandmother, who had spent her final years knitting by the fire and telling what Elena had assumed were fantasy tales, had been a warrior. Not just any warrior, but one whose abilities sounded like something from legend. "That's impossible," Elena whispered, though even as she said it, she remembered the way frost would form on the windows whenever her grandmother told her stories about ice magic, even in the middle of summer. Captain Thorne extended the bough toward her. "Touch it," he said simply. "If I'm wrong about what you are, nothing will happen. If I'm right." Elena reached out with trembling fingers. The moment her skin made contact with the pale wood, the world exploded into sensation. Cold fire raced up her arm and through her entire body, but instead of pain, she felt a sense of completion, as if a missing piece of herself had suddenly clicked into place. The bough seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and Elena could swear she heard whispers in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. Images flashed through her mind. Her grandmother as a young woman, drawing this same bough against creatures of shadow, arrows of pure ice materializing from the winter air itself. When the vision faded, Elena found herself holding the weapon with perfect familiarity, as if she had been training with it for years. The string hummed with potential energy, and she could feel something vast and cold awakening in the depths of her soul. Captain Thorne nodded grimly. "The blood runs true," he murmured. "Your training begins tomorrow at dawn. We have perhaps 2 weeks before the Shadow Legion reaches the mountain passes, and you have a lifetime of learning to compress into that time." Elena stared at the bough in her hands, her entire understanding of herself and her place in the world crumbling and reforming around this new reality. She was no longer just the blacksmith's daughter who preferred quiet corners and peaceful days. She was something else entirely, something she was only beginning to comprehend. That night, she lay awake listening to the wind whistle through the mountain peaks. In that sound, she could swear she heard the echo of her grandmother's voice, speaking words of encouragement and warning in equal measure. The bough rested beside her bed, and, even in the darkness, she could feel its presence like a second heartbeat. When she finally slept, her dreams were filled with ice and shadow, with battles fought at the edge of the world, and with the weight of a legacy she had never asked for but could no longer deny. Tomorrow would bring her first lesson in an art that had nearly died with her grandmother, and Elena could only hope that she would prove worthy of the weapon and the expectations that came with it. The village slept peacefully below, unaware that their fate now rested in the hands of a novice archer who was only beginning to understand the power that flowed through her veins like winter wine through mountain passes. Dawn came too early and not early enough. Elena had barely slept, her mind churning with questions and her body humming with the strange energy that had awakened when she touched her grandmother's bough. She dressed quickly in practical clothing, thick wool and leather that would allow for movement, and made her way to the training ground Captain Thorne had established in the village's largest clearing. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. Frost covered the grass in delicate patterns that reminded Elena uncomfortably of the visions she had experienced the night before. Other volunteers were already gathered, looking nervous but determined as they handled unfamiliar weapons under the watchful eyes of the royal guards. Captain Thorne spotted her immediately and approached with measured steps. In the morning light, Elena could see that his armor bore the marks of countless battles, small nicks and scratches that spoke of experience earned through survival rather than ceremony. "How do you feel?" he asked, his pale eyes studying her face for signs of the overwhelming nature of what she had learned. "Like my entire life has been a lie," Elena admitted, "but also like I'm finally awake for the first time." The captain nodded approvingly. "Good. Both of those feelings will serve you well in the days ahead. Come, we'll begin with the basics, though I suspect you'll find them familiar." He led her away from the main group to a secluded section of the training ground where targets had been set up at varying distances. The other volunteers were learning sword work and basic formation fighting, their training focused on conventional warfare. What Elena was about to learn was anything but conventional. The bow chooses its wielder as much as the wielder chooses the bow, Captain Thorne began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who had given this instruction before. But frost archery is different from conventional archery in fundamental ways. You're not just launching projectiles, you're shaping winter itself into weapons. Elena held her grandmother's bow, feeling its weight and balance. It was lighter than she had expected, but somehow felt more substantial than any physical object should. The pale wood was warm to the touch despite its appearance, and she could swear she felt a pulse running through it like a slow heartbeat. "Your grandmother could manifest arrows from thin air," Captain Thorne continued. "Ice given form and purpose, guided by will and shaped by necessity. But first, you need to understand the connection between yourself and the element you're calling upon." He gestured to the nearest target, a simple circle of hay bound with rope. "Try to hit it using a conventional arrow first. I need to see how much natural archery ability you possess." Elena accepted the ordinary arrow he offered, feeling immediately how different it was from what her instincts seemed to expect. The wood was rough and lifeless compared to the living energy of the bow itself. She knocked the arrow, drew back the string, and aimed as best she could with no formal training to guide her. The arrow flew wide, missing the target entirely and embedding itself in the hillside beyond. Elena felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but Captain Thorne seemed unsurprised. "Perfectly normal," he assured her. "Now try without an arrow at all. Draw the string back and focus on the target. Don't think about hitting it. Think about the cold, about winter morning air, about the way ice forms on windows." Elena looked at him skeptically, but followed his instructions. She drew back the empty string, feeling foolish, and tried to focus on cold rather than accuracy. As her mind settled on images of winter, something extraordinary began to happen. The air around the bow grew noticeably colder, and Elena's breath began to miss despite the mild morning temperature. Between her fingers and the string, something was taking shape. At first, it looked like crystallized air, but as her focus deepened, it solidified into something more substantial. An arrow of pure ice materialized between her fingers, its surface smooth as polished glass, but somehow radiating an aura of lethal sharpness. The fletching appeared to be made of frost that moved and shifted like tiny living things, and the point gleamed with an edge that looked capable of cutting through steel. Elena gasped at the sight, nearly releasing the string prematurely. The ice arrow remained stable, waiting for her command. "Now," Captain Thorne said quietly, "let your instincts guide you. Don't aim with your eyes, aim with your heart." Elena closed her eyes and drew back further, feeling the ice arrow grow more solid and deadly as her concentration deepened. In her mind, she could see the target not as a collection of hay and rope, but as a point of warmth in the cold morning air. When she released the string, it felt less like launching a projectile and more like extending her will across the distance between herself and her goal. The ice arrow struck the center of the target with a sound like breaking glass and freezing wind combined. Where it hit, frost began to spread outward in spiraling patterns, turning the entire target into a sculpture of ice within seconds. The cold was so intense that Elena could see it from 50 paces away, waves of frigid air rising from the frozen target like heat shimmer in reverse. Elena stared at what she had done, hardly able to believe it was real. The power she had just wielded felt vast and primal, like tapping into the fundamental force that turned water to ice and brought winter to the world. "Impressive," Captain Thorne said, though his tone suggested this was what he had expected. "Your grandmother could barely manage that on her first attempt, and she had been training conventionally for years before awakening to her abilities." Over the following days, Elena's training intensified. Captain Thorne proved to be a patient but demanding instructor, pushing her to understand not just the technique of frost archery, but the philosophy behind it. She learned that ice was not simply frozen water, but a state of being that could be imposed upon reality through will and connection to the elemental forces of winter. Each morning brought new challenges. She learned to create arrows of different types, piercing shafts that could punch through armor, spreading shots that would shatter into dozens of ice shards upon impact, and tracking arrows that would seek their targets like living things. The most difficult were what Captain Thorne called phantom shots, arrows that could pass through physical barriers to strike targets beyond, but those remained beyond her current abilities. The training was exhausting in ways Elena had never experienced. Physical archery was demanding enough, but frost archery drew upon something deeper. Each arrow she created pulled energy not just from her body, but from some well of power that seemed connected to her very essence. By the end of each day, she felt drained in ways that sleep couldn't entirely restore. But she was improving rapidly. Captain Thorne seemed surprised by her progress, though he tried to hide it. Elena could hit targets consistently now, at distances that would challenge even experienced conventional archers. More importantly, she was beginning to understand the flow of power that connected her to her abilities. It was during her 5th day of training that the first refugees arrived. Elena was practicing on moving targets, tracking suspended objects with ice arrows that curved through the air like guided missiles, when shouts arose from the village below. She and Captain Thorne rushed down to find a group of perhaps 20 people stumbling into the village square, their clothes torn and their faces bearing the haunted expressions of those who had seen horrors beyond description. The leader of the group was a middle-aged woman whose left arm hung useless at her side, clearly broken. She was supported by a teenage boy who looked ready to collapse himself. When Captain Thorne approached, she grabbed his armor with her good hand. "The eastern villages," she gasped, her voice hoarse from shouting and fear. "Millbrook, Riverside, all of them. Gone. Consumed by shadows that moved like living smoke. They came in the night, and by morning there was nothing left but empty husks where buildings used to stand." Captain Thorne's expression grew grim. "How many days ago?" "3, the woman replied. "We've been running since. The creatures, they don't just kill. They drain the warmth from everything they touch. People, animals, even the trees. Everything they encounter becomes cold and empty." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with her magical abilities. The Shadow Legion was moving faster than expected, consuming entire communities in their advance toward the mountain passes. If they had taken the eastern villages 3 days ago, they would reach the outer defensive position soon. Captain Thorne began organizing care for the refugees, while simultaneously sending riders to carry word to the capital. The timeline for their defense had just accelerated dramatically, and Elena's training was far from complete. That evening, as she practiced by lamplight in the growing darkness, Elena found herself thinking about the refugees' descriptions of the Shadow Legion. Creatures that drained warmth and life, that moved like living darkness, and left emptiness in their wake. It seemed like the perfect antithesis to the ice magic she was learning to wield. Ice was cold, but it was also structured, purposeful. It preserved and protected as much as it destroyed. The shadows these people described sounded like something that unmade rather than reshaped, that took without giving anything in return. Captain Thorne joined her as she worked through forms designed to improve her accuracy and speed. "You're thinking about the refugees," he observed. "How do you fight something that drains the warmth from everything it touches?" Elena asked. "If ice magic draws upon cold, what happens when we face something that embodies a cold that has nothing to do with winter or preservation?" It was a question that had been troubling her since hearing the woman's description. Her ice arrows were powerful, but they were still physical constructs that needed to impact their targets. What would happen against enemies that might not be entirely physical themselves? Captain Thorne was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandmother faced this same doubt," he said finally. "The Shadow Legion isn't truly cold in the way winter is cold. Their absence rather than presence. What you wield isn't just ice. It's the force of preservation, of life enduring through winter and emerging renewed in spring." He paused, watching as Elena created another ice arrow, this one more complex than her earlier attempts, with spiral patterns carved into its surface that caught and reflected the lamplight. "There's something else," he continued, "something your grandmother discovered during the last war. The phantom shots I've been teaching you about aren't just arrows that can pass through barriers. At their highest level, they can strike at the essence of things rather than just their physical form. But mastering them requires understanding something fundamental about the nature of reality itself." Elena looked at the ice arrow in her hands, seeing for the first time the way its internal structure seemed to extend beyond the physical boundaries of the ice itself. There were patterns there that her eyes couldn't quite track, geometries that seemed to fold back on themselves in ways that shouldn't have been possible. "Tomorrow," Captain Thorne said, "we begin training for phantom shots. Time is running short, and you'll need every advantage possible when the real battle begins." As Elena prepared for sleep that night, she found herself thinking not just about the techniques she was learning, but about the responsibility that came with them. She was no longer just a girl learning to use an inherited weapon. She was potentially the only thing standing between her people and the advancing darkness. The weight of that realization settled on her shoulders like a mantle of ice and starlight, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The morning of phantom shot training dawned with an ominous red sky that made the mountain peaks look like they were bleeding. Elena had spent a restless night filled with dreams of shadows that moved like liquid darkness and voices calling her name from empty spaces where villages used to be. She woke with frost coating her bedroom windows in patterns she didn't remember seeing when she went to sleep. Captain Thorne was waiting for her at the training ground before sunrise, but today he had brought additional equipment. Strange crystalline structures were arranged in precise geometric patterns around the practice area, each one humming with a barely audible resonance that seemed to vibrate in Elena's bones. "These are resonance crystals," he explained as she approached. "They help visualize the flow of magical energy, making it easier to understand the difference between conventional projectiles and phantom shots. Today, you're going to learn to shoot at things that exist in more than just the physical realm." Elena studied the crystals, noting how they seemed to bend light around them in subtle ways. Standing near them made her newly awakened magical senses tingle, as if they were amplifying something that had always been present but undetectable. "I don't understand," she admitted. "What do you mean by things that exist in more than the physical realm?" Instead of answering directly, Captain Thorne drew his own weapon for the first time since she had known him. Elena had assumed he was a conventional warrior, but the sword that emerged from his scabbard was clearly magical. The blade appeared to be forged from solidified moonlight, translucent and gleaming with its own internal radiance. Every living thing has layers, he said, holding the blade so that the morning light passed through it and cast rainbow patterns on the ground. Physical form, life, energy, spiritual essence, and deeper things that most people never learn to perceive. The Shadow Legion doesn't just attack bodies. They attack all layers simultaneously. That's why conventional weapons are largely ineffective against them. He pointed the blade toward one of the practice targets, and Elena watched in fascination as the weapon seemed to extend beyond its physical boundaries, becoming longer and more complex in ways her eyes struggled to process. A phantom shot works the same way, Captain Thorne continued. You're not just sending ice through the air, you're sending your will, your intention, and your connection to the elemental forces through multiple layers of reality simultaneously. The ice is just the physical manifestation of something much more complex. He handed her 3 arrows, but these were unlike anything she had seen before. They appeared to be carved from ordinary wood, but when Elena touched them, she could feel vast depths of complexity hidden within their simple exteriors. These were crafted by your grandmother, Captain Thorne said. She spent years learning to create arrows that could bridge the gap between physical and phantom shooting. They'll help you understand the transition. Elena knocked the first arrow and drew back her grandmother's bow. The moment the special arrow came into contact with the magical string, something remarkable happened. Instead of simply creating an ice arrow to replace it, the bow seemed to harmonize with the wooden shaft, transforming it into something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. She could see the arrow as wood, but she could also see it as pure intention, as crystallized will, and as a bridge between her consciousness and the target she intended to strike. The sensation was overwhelming and exhilarating. Now, Captain Thorne said quietly, aim not at the target's surface, but at its center. Imagine you can see through it to what lies beyond, and shoot at that deeper layer. Elena closed her eyes and extended her awareness toward the target. To her surprise, she could sense something beyond the simple hay and rope construction. There was a pattern of life energy, residual traces from the grass that had been cut to make the hay, and beneath that, something even more fundamental. She released the arrow, feeling it pass through layers of reality like a stone dropped through still water. When she opened her eyes, the target looked unchanged, but she could sense that something fundamental about it had been altered. Captain Thorne approached the target and placed his hand against its surface. His expression grew pleased. Excellent. Look more carefully. Elena focused her attention on the target and gasped. While it appeared physically intact, she could now perceive that its internal structure had been completely transformed. The phantom arrow had passed through the physical material and restructured the life energy within it, turning the random arrangement of grass into a perfectly ordered crystalline pattern. You didn't just hit the target, Captain Thorne explained. You impose your will upon its essential nature. That's the foundation of phantom shooting, the ability to affect things at levels deeper than the merely physical. The second arrow proved more challenging. This time, Captain Thorne set up a target with a stone wall directly in front of it. The goal was to hit the target without damaging the wall, requiring Elena to shoot through solid matter rather than around it. Elena struggled with this concept initially. Every instinct told her that arrows couldn't pass through stone walls, no matter what magical properties they possessed. But as she practiced, she began to understand that phantom shots weren't constrained by the same physical laws that govern conventional projectiles. The key was to stop thinking of the arrow as a physical object moving through space, and instead envision it as a directed intention that could manifest wherever she willed it to appear. The wall was only an obstacle if she chose to perceive it as one. When she finally succeeded, the arrow appeared embedded in the target behind the wall, without leaving any trace of its passage through the stone. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced, as if she had reached across impossible distance to touch something with her mind rather than her hands. The third arrow was the most difficult of all. For this exercise, Captain Thorne arranged a complex series of barriers and mirrors, creating a maze-like structure that would require multiple course corrections for any projectile to successfully navigate. Phantom shots can change direction, he explained. They can split into multiple projectiles, merge back together, and even pause midair before continuing to their targets. But this requires understanding that the arrow is an extension of your will rather than a separate object you've launched. Elena spent hours working with the third arrow, learning to maintain her connection to it after release, and guide its path through the complex obstacle course. The mental discipline required was exhausting, demanding perfect concentration and an understanding of spatial relationships that seemed to transcend normal geometry. But gradually, she began to grasp the fundamental principle. The phantom arrow didn't move through space so much as it reappeared in successive locations, following the path of her intention rather than the constraints of physical motion. She could direct it around corners, through barriers, and even backwards toward herself if necessary. By afternoon, she was successfully hitting targets that were completely hidden from her direct line of sight, using phantom arrows that navigated impossible courses with precision that would have challenged the most skilled conventional archer. It was during this advanced training that the second group of refugees arrived. These survivors brought far worse news than the first group. The Shadow Legion wasn't just consuming villages, it was accelerating, growing stronger and faster with each settlement it absorbed. More concerning still, they were displaying tactical intelligence that suggested coordination rather than simple, mindless hunger. Elena listened with growing alarm as the refugees described shadow creatures that could think and plan, that set ambushes and cut off escape routes. The entity leading them was more than just a destructive force. It was a strategic intelligence that understood warfare. "How long do we have?" she asked Captain Thorne as they watched the refugees being tended to by the village healers. "Perhaps 5 days," he replied grimly. "Maybe less if they continue to accelerate. The mountain passes are our best defensive position, but we'll need every advantage possible to hold them." That evening, as Elena practiced her phantom shots by starlight, she found herself pushing the technique further than Captain Thorne had taught her. She began experimenting with arrows that could strike multiple targets simultaneously, projectiles that could remain dormant until triggered, and shots that seemed to exist in a state of quantum uncertainty until the moment of impact. The bow responded to her innovations with increasing enthusiasm, its palewood glowing faintly as she channeled more complex intentions through it. Elena began to suspect that her grandmother's weapon was more than just a tool. It was a reservoir of accumulated knowledge and experience, responding to her growing understanding by revealing deeper layers of its capabilities. During one particularly ambitious experiment, Elena attempted to create a phantom arrow that could exist in 2 places simultaneously. The result was beyond anything she had imagined possible. The arrow split into multiple instances of itself, each one existing independently while remaining connected to her original intention. She could direct them separately or as a unified force, creating a coordinated attack pattern that would be impossible for enemies to predict or defend against. Captain Thorne, watching from the sidelines, looked both impressed and troubled by her rapid advancement. "Your grandmother took years to develop techniques like that," he said quietly. "You're progressing far faster than should be possible." Elena paused in her practice, suddenly aware of how naturally the advanced phantom techniques were coming to her. It felt less like learning something new and more like remembering knowledge that had always been part of her. "Is that dangerous?" she asked. Captain Thorne considered the question carefully. "Power that comes too easily can be seductive," he said finally. "But in our current circumstances, rapid advancement might be the only thing that saves us all. Just remember that magic is a tool, not an identity. Don't let what you can do become more important than why you're doing it." As Elena prepared for sleep that night, she found herself wondering about the nature of the power she was developing. The phantom shots felt limitless in their potential, constrained only by her imagination and will. Part of her was excited by the possibilities, but another part worried about Captain Thorne's warning. She placed her grandmother's bow beside her bed and tried to sense the accumulated memories it contained. In the depths of the pale wood, she could feel echoes of battles fought and victories won, but also a deep sadness that she couldn't quite understand. Tomorrow would bring the final phase of her training, and soon after that, the real test would begin. Elena fell asleep hoping that she would prove worthy of the legacy she carried, but uncertain whether she truly understood the price that mastery of phantom shots might ultimately demand. The evacuation began at dawn on the 8th day of Elena's training. Word had come during the night that the Shadow Legion had reached the outer valleys, consuming 3 more villages in a single evening and leaving behind nothing but crystalline husks where life had once thrived. Captain Thorn made the decision to abandon the village and fall back to the mountain passes, where the terrain would provide better defensive positions. Elena watched from the hillside as families loaded their possessions onto carts and began the journey toward the ancient fortifications that guarded the high passes. Children cried as they were separated from homes they had never left before, while adults moved with the grim efficiency of people who understood that survival depended on swift action. Her father approached as she stood observing the exodus, his weathered hands carrying a pack that contained her few personal belongings along with supplies for the journey ahead. "I should be going with them," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't true. Willem shook his head. "Your place is here, daughter. I've seen what you've become over these past days. The ice responds to you like it's part of your soul. And that bow." He glanced at the weapon slung across her shoulder. "That bow has been waiting for you your entire life." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last of the villagers disappear into the pine forest that led toward the mountain passes. Soon, only Elena, Captain Thorn, and 24 of his most experienced soldiers remained in the village that had been her home for 17 years. Captain Thorn joined them on the hillside, his expression reflecting the weight of the decisions he had made. "The refugees will reach the fortress by evening," he said. "We'll follow in their wake, but slowly. I want the Shadow Legion to know we're here. I want them to focus on us rather than pursuing the civilians." Elena understood the strategy. They were making themselves bait, drawing the enemy's attention while buying time for the evacuation to reach safety. It was a dangerous gamble that depended on their ability to stay ahead of the pursuing darkness while remaining visible enough to maintain their role as a target. "How long can we keep that up?" she asked. "Long enough," Captain Thorn replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely certain of that assessment. The retreat began that afternoon. Elena found herself moving through familiar forests and along mountain trails she had known since childhood. But everything felt different now. The landscape seemed charged with potential energy, as if the approaching conflict was affecting the very nature of reality in the region. Her magical senses, grown stronger over the past week of intensive training, could detect disturbances in the natural flow of life energy throughout the valley. Where the Shadow Legion had passed, the earth itself felt wounded, drained of the vital force that normally coursed through all living things. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Elena began to understand why these passes had been chosen as defensive positions. The paths were narrow and winding, with steep drops on either side that would funnel any attacking force into predictable corridors. Ancient stone fortifications crowned the highest ridges, their weathered walls bearing the scars of conflicts fought generations ago. But Elena could also see the disadvantages of their position. The Shadow Legion wasn't bound by the same physical constraints that limited conventional armies. If they could move through solid matter the way her phantom arrows passed through barriers, the defensive terrain would provide little advantage. It was during their second night of retreat that Elena experienced her first direct encounter with the enemy. She had volunteered for watch duty, her enhanced senses making her more effective at detecting approaching threats than the conventional soldiers. The night was clear and cold, with stars providing just enough light to make out the shapes of the surrounding mountains. Elena sat on a rocky outcropping above their camp, practicing silent phantom shots at distant targets to maintain her skills. The first sign of danger was a change in the temperature of the air around her. What had been a normal mountain chill began to deepen into something that felt actively hostile, as if winter itself had become predatory. Elena's breath began to mist, and frost started forming on the rocks around her despite the mild weather. Then she saw them. Moving up the valley below, darker shapes flowed between the trees like liquid night given form. They moved without sound, without the natural rhythms of living creatures. Where they passed, Elena could see vegetation withering and dying, the life force being drawn out of everything they touched. Elena counted at least 30 of the creatures, each one roughly human in size, but lacking any fixed shape. They shifted and flowed as they moved, sometimes appearing almost solid, other times dissolving into mist before reforming a few paces away. At their center moved something larger and more structured, a figure that retained enough solidity to suggest intelligence and purpose. Elena slipped back toward the camp to alert Captain Thorn, but she had barely moved when one of the shadow creatures suddenly looked up directly at her position. Its eyeless face tilted in her direction with an awareness that made her blood run cold. The thing had sensed her despite the distance and her careful concealment. The creature pointed toward her position and let out a sound unlike anything Elena had ever heard. It was silence given voice, a negation of sound that somehow carried clearly across the valley. The other shadows responded immediately, flowing up the mountainside with speed that defied the steep terrain. Elena didn't hesitate. She drew her grandmother's bow and manifested an ice arrow in a single fluid motion, drawing back the string and releasing toward the leading creature. The phantom shot past through 3 trees and 2 boulders before striking its target. But instead of the explosion of frost she expected, the arrow seemed to be absorbed by the creature's dark form. The shadow paused momentarily, its shape flickering as if disrupted, but then continued its advance apparently unharmed. Elena tried again, this time with multiple arrows launched in rapid succession. Some struck home, while others passed through the creatures entirely, as if they could choose which attacks to acknowledge and which to ignore. A few of her shots seemed to cause damage, creating tears in their dark forms that leaked something that might have been shadow blood, but the creatures pressed forward relentlessly. By now the camp was awakening to the sounds of combat. Captain Thorn and his soldiers emerged from their sleeping roles with weapons ready, but Elena could see the doubt in their faces as they took in the nature of their attackers. Swords and armor were designed to face human enemies. These creatures required something entirely different. Form a defensive circle, Captain Thorn commanded. Elena, get to the center and use your range advantage. But as Elena moved to comply, she realized that conventional tactics weren't going to work against enemies that could flow through gaps in their formation like water through a net. The shadow creatures reached the camp perimeter and immediately demonstrated their ability to bypass physical defenses. Elena watched in horror as one of the creatures flowed around a soldier's raised shield and made contact with his arm. The man screamed as life force was literally drained from his body, his skin growing pale and his eyes losing their spark of vitality. He didn't die so much as become empty, his body remaining upright, but no longer containing anything recognizable as human consciousness. Elena felt rage building in her chest, a cold fury that resonated with her ice magic in ways she had never experienced before. The phantom arrow techniques she had been learning suddenly felt inadequate. She needed something more fundamental, more destructive. Drawing on instincts she didn't know she possessed, Elena began to create arrows that existed entirely in the phantom realm rather than manifesting physically. These projectiles appeared as distortions in the air, visible only as slight bends in starlight, and shadows that moved independently of their surroundings. When these arrows struck the shadow creatures, the effect was dramatically different. Instead of being absorbed or ignored, they seemed to tear holes in the creature's essential nature. The shadows writhed and made their horrible anti-sounds as chunks of their dark essence were destroyed rather than simply disrupted. Elena found herself fighting with techniques that Captain Thorn had never taught her, abilities that seemed to emerge from the bow itself or from some deeper connection to her grandmother's accumulated knowledge. She created arrows that would seek out and destroy the life-draining auras surrounding the creatures, shots that would multiply and spread like infection through their dark forms, and phantom projectiles that struck at the fundamental forces that held the shadows together. The battle lasted only minutes, but by its end, Elena had single-handedly destroyed more than half of the attacking force. The surviving creatures retreated down the mountain with their horrible fluid grace, leaving behind only empty spaces where their destroyed companions had been. The cost of victory was sobering. 3 of Captain Thorn's soldiers had been drained of life force, their bodies standing like empty shells until they finally collapsed. 2 others had been partially affected, their vitality diminished, but not completely destroyed. They might recover, but it would take time they probably didn't have. Captain Thorn approached Elena as she stared at the destruction she had caused. The bow in her hands was still humming with residual energy, and frost patterns covered the ground in complex spirals around where she stood. "Those techniques," he said quietly. "Where did you learn them?" Elena shook her head, unsure how to explain what had happened. "I didn't learn them. They just emerged, like the bow was teaching me as I fought. Captain Thorne's expression was troubled. Your grandmother mentioned something like that in her final letter to me. She said the bow contained more than just her own knowledge, that was connected to something older and more dangerous than individual experience. Elena looked down at the weapon that had become such a natural extension of herself. Dangerous how? Power seeks balance, Captain Thorne said carefully. The greater your ability to destroy, the greater the risk of losing yourself to that ability. Your grandmother spent her final years trying to understand that balance. She never quite succeeded. As they prepared to break camp and continue their retreat, Elena found herself wondering about the nature of the power she was developing. The phantom shot techniques felt limitless, constrained only by her imagination and will. But Captain Thorne's words reminded her that unlimited power had always been as much curse as blessing. The Shadow Legion would pursue them again soon, in greater numbers and with better understanding of what they faced. Elena's abilities would undoubtedly continue to evolve under pressure, but she was beginning to understand that evolution might come at a cost she wasn't prepared to pay. The final stand came at the Crown Gate, the highest and most defensible pass through the mountains. Ancient fortifications built by long-dead kings commanded the narrow corridor, where any army would be forced to approach in single file, their walls carved directly into the living rock of the mountain peaks. Elena stood on the highest tower, looking down at the approach where the Shadow Legion would soon appear, and tried to prepare herself for what was to come. 3 days had passed since their first encounter with the enemy. The retreat had been a running battle, with shadow creatures harrying their rear guard while the main force of the Legion consumed everything in their wake. Elena's abilities had continued to evolve under pressure, her phantom shots becoming more powerful and complex with each engagement, but the cost was beginning to show. She could feel something changing inside her, a coldness that went deeper than her ice magic and seemed to touch her very essence. Each time she drew upon the bow's power, each time she manifested those devastating phantom arrows, something warm and human was being traded away for something vast and terrible. Captain Thorne joined her on the battlements, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the defensive preparations below. The surviving soldiers were positioning themselves at choke points throughout the fortress, while civilian refugees huddled in the deepest chambers, hoping that stone walls would protect them from enemies that could drain life itself. The main force will reach us by sunset, he said, consulting reports from their scouts. Our estimates suggest over 1,000 shadow creatures, led by something our people couldn't get close enough to identify. Elena nodded absently, her attention focused on the changes she could sense in her grandmother's bow. The weapon seemed more alive now, pulsing with energies that felt increasingly independent of her conscious control. Sometimes she caught glimpses of memories that weren't her own, battles fought in places she had never seen, enemies destroyed by techniques she had never learned, and always the gradual transformation of the wielder into something that was more weapon than person. "Captain," she said quietly, "what happened to my grandmother at the end?" "Really?" Thorne was silent for a long moment, watching clouds gather around the mountain peaks. "She saved the kingdom," he said finally, "but the cost was everything that made her human. By the time the last battle was won, she had become something else entirely, something that could destroy any enemy, but could no longer remember what it meant to love or laugh or grieve." Elena felt ice form in her veins as she understood the implication. "And you think that's what's happening to me?" "I think," Captain Thorne said carefully, "that power like yours doesn't come without consequences. The question is whether you can find a way to pay those consequences while retaining enough of yourself to remember why the fight matters." As if summoned by their conversation, the first shadows appeared on the approach to the fortress. They flowed up the mountain path like a dark tide, their forms shifting between solid and ethereal as they moved. But these were different from the advanced scouts Elena had faced before. These creatures moved with coordinated purpose, maintaining formations that suggested intelligence and strategic planning. At their head came something that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. The Void King stood 9 feet tall, his form maintaining enough stability to display the remnants of what had once been armor and weapons. Unlike his mindless followers, this creature radiated personality, malevolent intelligence that viewed the world as nothing more than fuel for its endless hunger. Elena could see the aura of absolute cold that surrounded the Void King, a negation of warmth and life that withered everything within 50 feet of his presence. The mountain stone cracked and blackened where he stepped, and the very air seemed to recoil from his passage. "Now we see what you've truly become," Captain Thorne murmured, stepping back to give Elena room to work. Elena drew her grandmother's bow and felt the weapon respond with eager enthusiasm. Power flowed through her with intensity that made her earlier battles seem like practice exercises. She could create arrows that would devastate entire formations, phantom shots that would seek out and destroy every enemy on the battlefield, techniques that would make her the equal of any force the Shadow Legion could deploy. But as the power built within her, Elena felt the last warm parts of her humanity being consumed like fuel. She could feel herself becoming something like the Void King, a being of pure purpose and ability that had no connection to the people she was supposedly protecting. In that moment of realization, Elena made a choice that would have horrified her grandmother and amazed Captain Thorne. Instead of drawing upon the bow's full power, instead of becoming the weapon of mass destruction she was capable of becoming, Elena pulled back. She deliberately limited herself, maintaining connection to the warmth and fear and love that made her human, even knowing it would make her less effective in battle. She drew back the string and manifested a single phantom arrow, but this one was different from anything she had created before. Instead of being formed from pure ice and destructive intent, this arrow contained something of her own essence, her own humanity preserved in crystalline form. The arrow she released was smaller than her previous phantom shots, less obviously powerful, less capable of widespread destruction. But as it flew toward the Void King, something remarkable happened. The other shadow creatures, those mindless consumers of life and warmth, began to react to the arrow's passage. Wherever it flew, Elena could see sparks of something that might have been memory or longing flickering in their dark forms. The arrow wasn't just a weapon. It was a reminder of what they had lost, what they had been before becoming creatures of pure hunger. The phantom shot struck the Void King's center mass, passing through his dark armor and into whatever served as his heart. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, the creature let out a sound unlike anything Elena had ever heard, a cry that contained all the anguish and loss of every life he had consumed. The Void King staggered, his form becoming less stable as cracks of light began to appear in his dark essence. Elena could see through those cracks to something that had once been human, a king who had chosen power over compassion and become the very evil he had tried to defeat. But instead of destroying the creature, Elena's arrow began to transform him. The consuming hunger that had driven him for decades was being replaced by something else, something that remembered what it meant to protect rather than devour. The darkness that composed his form began to shift, becoming less absolute, more complex. Throughout the Shadow Legion, similar transformations were beginning. Elena's phantom shot had somehow propagated through the mystical connections between the Void King and his followers, carrying its message of preserved humanity to creatures that had forgotten they had ever been anything else. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded history. Instead of a clash between forces of light and darkness, it became a struggle between hunger and redemption, between the impulse to consume and the desire to preserve. Elena found herself fighting not to destroy the Shadow Legion, but to heal them, using phantom arrows that carried memory and warmth into their cold forms. Some of the creatures were too far gone, too thoroughly consumed by their hunger to be reached. These Elena destroyed with conventional phantom shots, but she mourned each one as a life lost rather than an enemy defeated. Others responded to her arrows of preserved humanity, their dark forms cracking open to reveal the people they had once been. The Void King himself proved to be the most challenging opponent, not because of his power, but because of the depth of his despair. He had been lost in darkness for so long that he had forgotten his original name, his original purpose, everything that had made him human. Elena found herself locked in a battle that was as much psychological as physical, using phantom arrows that carried not just her own humanity, but the accumulated memories and love of everyone she was trying to protect. The turning point came when Elena realized that victory didn't require her to become a perfect weapon. It required her to remain perfectly human, to preserve within herself everything that the Shadow Legion had lost and forgotten. She created a final phantom arrow that contained not just her own essence, but the essence of her father's unconditional love, Captain Thorne's protective dedication, her grandmother's wisdom, and the simple joy of life in a mountain village where people cared for each other. This arrow, when it struck the Void King, didn't destroy him or transform him. Instead, it reminded him of what he had been fighting to protect all those years ago, before power had corrupted his purpose and turned him into the very evil he had opposed. The king fell to his knees as memories flooded back through him, and, with his surrender, the remaining Shadow Legion lost their cohesion. Some simply dissolved back into the natural darkness from which they had been formed. Others transformed back into the people they had been before being consumed, confused, and displaced but alive. Elena found herself standing on the battlefield as dawn broke over the mountains, still holding her grandmother's bow, but feeling more like herself than she had since the training began. She had discovered that true strength didn't come from embracing the weapon's full potential, but from maintaining enough humanity to remember what was worth protecting. Captain Thorne approached her as the survivors began to emerge from the fortress, his expression a mixture of admiration and profound relief. "You found a different path," he said quietly. "Your grandmother would be proud." Elena looked at the bow in her hands, feeling the vast power it contained, but no longer fearing what it might cost her to use. She had learned to be strong enough to choose weakness when strength would mean losing herself, and wise enough to preserve what mattered even in the midst of transformation. The war was over, but Elena's real journey was just beginning. She would spend the rest of her life learning to balance the power she carried with the humanity she had chosen to preserve, becoming not just a wielder of phantom shots, but a guardian of the warmth and connection that made life worth living. In the years that followed, songs would be sung about the battle at Crown Gate, about the novice archer whose frozen phantom shot had turned the tide of war. But those who had been there remembered something more important. The moment when someone had been strong enough to choose love over power, and wise enough to understand that some victories could only be won by remaining human.